Billy, Hank, flank 'em. Wilson, you and the rest of the fellas follow me. We'll hit 'em head on. Come on.
He was a towering presence in America's living rooms, a lovable giant whose kindness seemed almost too good to be true. But behind the screen, behind the cowboy hat and gentle smile, lived a man few ever really knew. Now, after decades of silence, his son has broken that silence with a single revelation. It's not scandalous, it's not sensational, but it is something fans have whispered about for years, something quietly powerful and deeply personal. What did we all suspect? And why did it take a lifetime for the truth to surface? Let's just say, it changes how you'll see Dan Blocker forever. Behind the legend. Away from the bright lights of Hollywood and the rugged Western set of Bonanza, Dan Blocker was a man of quiet strength and genuine humility. Despite his towering frame and fame, he exuded a calm, approachable presence that immediately put others at ease. He wasn't someone who sought attention off-screen. In fact, he often downplayed his celebrity status and shied away from the spotlight when the cameras stopped rolling. Blocker's nature was grounded, thoughtful, and marked by an emotional intelligence that contrasted sharply with the boisterous, sometimes exaggerated world of television. Family and friends often spoke of Dan with deep admiration, not just for his talent, but for the kind of man he was when no one was watching. His wife, Dolphia, frequently described him as a gentle and attentive husband who cherished family life above all else. Colleagues from Bonanza recounted stories of Dan's generosity and patience on set, how he would go out of his way to support younger actors or crew members and never let ego dictate his interactions. Michael Landon, a close friend and co-star, once referred to him as the most decent man I ever worked with, a sentiment echoed by many who knew him. Dan's generosity wasn't performative. Rather, it was consistent, deeply ingrained, and present even in the most ordinary moments. Whether assisting crewmen with equipment or quietly giving to charities without making a public show of it, he proved that compassion didn't require an audience. His son Durk would look back later on how Dan treated individuals with the same deference, irrespective of their status or title, a rule he adhered to strictly at home and on the set. In a business frequently controlled by image, Dan was refreshingly honest. This dichotomy between his on-screen character and off-stage persona was remarkable. Although crowds adored the affable, clumsy charm of Hoss Cartwright, Dan Blocker off-stage was much more taciturn and introspective. He read voraciously, enjoyed philosophy, and had strong feelings about justice and fairness. Yet he never used his vehicle to sermonize. Instead, he lived by his values quietly, becoming the sort of fellow who won people's respect, not for what he said, but for how he treated them. But long before Dan Blocker became the calm force behind the camera, his story was already larger than life, starting from the very moment he entered the world. Born big, living larger. Dan Blocker's story began with a literal big entrance into the world. Born on December 10, 1928, in the small East Texas town of DeKalb, he weighed a remarkable 14 pounds at birth, an almost mythic figure that foreshadowed his commanding presence throughout life. His family soon moved to O'Donnell, Texas, where he would spend most of his formative years. In a tight-knit, working-class community where everyone knew everyone, Dan quickly stood out, not just for his kind demeanor, but for his exceptional size. Locals affectionately nicknamed him the Big 'Un, a moniker that stuck throughout his youth. Having grown up in a rural setting, Dan was not unfamiliar with hard work. His parents ran a small grocery store in town, and even as a youngster, he assisted wherever he could, bagging groceries for customers, stocking shelves, and helping out with deliveries. Outside the shop, he did physically challenging work since early childhood, laboring alongside adult men carrying grain, moving crates, and assisting with building construction. O'Donnell's life wasn't luxurious, but it hardened him. instilled discipline, and imparted physical working knowledge to him that other boys of his age hadn't yet encountered. By the time he was 10, Dan's abnormal strength was already the talk of the town. He was taller, wider, and stronger than most men in the town, and by age 12, he had reached over 6 feet tall and weighed more than 200 pounds. While other children may have been scared of his size, Dan's affable nature kept altercations to a minimum. Though some neighborhood roughnecks did push him around, they never succeeded. His size wasn't simply a matter of fact, it was an identity, a self-defining aspect of who he was and how others perceived him. Teachers, classmates, and townspeople alike treated him like more man than a boy. Physically mature far beyond his years, Dan's presence in the community carried both awe and expectations. Whether working a job or walking through town, people instinctively turned to him for help with heavy lifting, fixing things, or settling disputes. It wasn't that he sought out responsibility, but rather that it followed him. O'Donnell was a small town, perhaps, but to Dan Blocker, it provided a stage substantial enough to shape the foundation of a young man whose physical size wasn't merely unusual, it was integral to the persona he bore with him well before fame ever discovered him. The war that changed him. When Dan Blocker joined the U.S. Army after college, he was assigned to the 179th Infantry Regiment and eventually rose to the rank of sergeant. His imposing size, standing over 6'3" and weighing around 300 pounds, made him a natural leader on the battlefield. But the challenges he faced in the Korean War tested far more than just physical strength. By late 1951, he found himself on the front lines near Chorwon, a critical area in the brutal Pork Chop Hill campaign. The terrain was unforgiving, the winter was bitterly cold, and the combat was relentless. Blocker, like many others, was thrust into a world of constant danger, mud-soaked trenches, and sleepless nights. Pork Chop Hill was one of the most brutal and expensive battles of the war, and Dan saw its horrors up close. As a combat infantryman, he guided men through enemy fire, frequently under shelling and sniper fire that left little margin for error or fear. One evening, during a particularly heavy firefight, Dan saw a wounded fellow soldier pinned down and vulnerable to enemy fire. Without hesitation, he pushed through the mayhem to pull the man to safety, a heroic action that left him injured and for which he received the Purple Heart. The physical cost was great. Frostbite, fatigue, and residual injuries accompanied him long after he departed the battlefield. The emotional wounds were just as lasting. Dan saw young men, some only in high school, die in cruel and unnecessary fashion. He watched friends die at his side and experienced months of psychological stress that dissolved any notions he might have had regarding warfare glory. The haunting terror, the crying during the night, and the chilling aftermath of each conflict indelibly marked him. Blocker would never have spoken of his service in melodramatic or braggart terms. Rather, he bore it silently, with a gravitas that implied the price of survival was not merely bodily. When he came back home, Dan Blocker was no longer the same young man who had enlisted. The war had made him face mortality, suffering, and the reality of violence. He became more reflective, more cautious in how he perceived conflict and power. The violence of Korea had not embittered him, but it had deepened his sense of human vulnerability and the cost of violence. To others, there may have been a towering presence, but Dan bore the secret weight of one who had witnessed too much, too soon, and grown wiser with the cost of war. An actor by accident. Dan Blocker's path to acting was anything but planned. During his time at Sul Ross State University, he was initially focused on academics and athletics, particularly football, where his size and strength made him a formidable presence on the field. He had no intention of pursuing the arts, let alone theater, until a simple backstage favor changed everything. One day, the college drama department needed someone strong to help move heavy stage props for a production of Arsenic and Old Lace. Dan volunteered, expecting nothing more than a quick task. But when a minor role opened up and someone suggested he fill in, he agreed, almost as a joke. What had started off as a spontaneous act of kindness soon turned into something greater. Much to his own astonishment, Dan was drawn to the stage immediately. He found a sense of expression and fulfillment in performing that he hadn't been able to find anywhere else, not even in sports. Spurred on by the reaction he had received and the thrill of performing, he began to investigate the world of the theater more seriously. It was not long before he decided to switch his major to drama from English, a decision that surprised everyone, his coaches and professors included. Dan's interest soon turned into passion, and upon the completion of his undergraduate studies, he embarked on graduate school in theater at Hardin-Simmons University and later Baylor University. He eventually migrated to New York City with a goal of honing his craft and testing the limits of his new passion for acting. Soaked in the atmosphere of stage lights and Shakespearean monologues, he performed in small shows and grasped any part that would assist him in developing. He studied hard, accepting both the physical and emotional aspects of performing with the same eagerness that he had previously exhibited on the football field. What is so amazing about Dan's path to acting is the sheer randomness of it. No lifelong aspiration to stardom, no theater ambitions as a child, simply an impulsive moment of opportunity revealing a latent talent. His introduction to the world of performance was not driven by ego or image, but by curiosity and an openness to exploring something new. In an age where most pursue acting for fame, Dan Blocker accidentally found it and sought after it because it just felt right. The role that changed television. Beirut. Hoss Cartwright, as portrayed in Bonanza, was a rare and refreshing representation of masculinity on television during the late 1950s and 1960s. In a genre often dominated by stoic gunslingers and hard-edged loners, Hoss stood out as a character driven not by bravado, but by compassion. He was physically imposing, yet emotionally open, a gentle giant who was quick to laugh, even quicker to forgive, and unafraid to show vulnerability. Hoss embodied a kind of strength rooted in empathy and moral clarity rather than aggression or dominance, making him an unconventional but deeply endearing figure in the Western landscape. Viewers reacted to Hoss with universal warmth. Children in particular were attracted to his genuineness and straightforwardness, while adult viewers enjoyed his unwavering sense of justice and devotion to his family. In contrast to most TV characters of the era, Hoss seemed accessible, more like a trusted friend or loving older brother than an aloof hero. His honesty, humility, and humor humanized Bonanza, providing a touch of warmth that offset the show's action and dramatic episodes. Audiences identified with Hoss as a man who wasn't perfect, but always attempted to do the right thing, and in many instances, succeeded more by heart than by brawn. As the show went on, Hoss Cartwright became the emotional fulcrum of the Ponderosa. He regularly served as the peacekeeper among the Cartwright brothers, tempering the stronger-headed brothers and their authoritative but affectionate father. His own storylines regularly involved themes of justice, assisting the underdog, or challenging injustice in a manner that reflected his strong sense of right and wrong. These scenes provided the character with a rare emotional depth during that era, which not only featured action, but also actual emotional conflict and development, making the character even more endearing to audiences. Hoss's influence went well beyond entertainment. He redefined what it was to be a tough guy on television. At a time when toughness was routinely connected with silence and stoicism, Hoss demonstrated that gentleness could be tough, that humor didn't undermine dignity, and that emotional sensitivity wasn't weakness, but strength. His presence subtly subverted ancient archetypes and became a legacy as one of the most human and emotional figures in the Western genre, a legacy that sustained itself well past the original run of the show. But while Hoss Cartwright brought warmth to millions, the man behind the role was quietly battling something far more isolating: the hidden toll of fame. Though Dan Blocker was a huge success playing Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza, the adoration that accompanied it was something he never came to appreciate. Not like a lot of actors who reveled in the attention, Dan found public scrutiny a constant drain on his emotions and sometimes extremely invasive. His massive physical stature made it all but impossible for him to go through life incognito. No matter if he was eating with his family, going out on errands, or just attempting to have a day out, the fans knew him immediately and tended to mob for autographs or pictures. Though he appreciated the love people had for his character, the invasion of privacy took its toll on him. These constant intrusions eroded his personal space and mental calm, making him more and more reclusive in social situations. The celebrity strain wasn't just impacting Dan himself, it crept into his home life and altered the dynamics of their everyday routines. His children weren't able to go anywhere without being hailed as Hoss's kids, and his wife, Dolphia, often had to contend with the emotional toll of being wed to a man who couldn't ever seem to switch off for public consumption. What might have otherwise been ordinary family excursions became cringeworthy public spectacles. The ceaseless attention of them, the unsolicited commentary of strangers, and the growing interest of the media in the personal lives of television personalities all served to instill a sense of unease that lingered in their home. For Dan, the burden was not only professional, it became personal, slowly eroding the distinction between his public self and private life. By the late 1960s, Dan seriously started thinking about how he was going to distance himself from the endless requirements of Hollywood. As much as he enjoyed his career, he longed for a less frenetic, earthly existence, a place where he and his family could live without endless interruption. It was a longing that ultimately led to the relocation to Switzerland. It wasn't due to scandal or money problems, but an authentic desire for peace. In the Swiss countryside, he found refuge from the constant glare of fame. The language barrier and the relatively low profile of Bonanza in Europe allowed him to recapture a sense of normalcy. His children were able to attend school without being recognized, and Dan was able to walk through town as a man, not a character. This retreat was a deliberate attempt to protect his mental health and the emotional well-being of his loved ones. In the serene landscapes around Lake Lugano and Lake Como, Dan finally felt a shroud of anonymity that had thus far eluded him. It wasn't about hiding, it was about healing. The weight of always being on, always performing for an audience, had become unsustainable. Switzerland gave him the freedom to breathe without condemnation, to rest without insistence, and to be husband and father without interruption. For Dan Blocker, the hidden price of fame was never ego or ambition. It was the unassuming desire for a life where he could simply exist without being constantly watched. Standing tall against injustice. During the height of Bonanza's popularity, the cast and crew often traveled across the country to shoot on location or make public appearances. On one such trip through the American South in the early 1960s, the production team encountered a harsh reminder of the era's deeply rooted racial segregation. When they arrived at a hotel to check in for the night, they were met with a disturbing policy. The establishment refused to accommodate the African-American members of the crew. It was not a request or suggestion. It was a clear and unapologetic act of discrimination, common in the Jim Crow South, and one that stunned the entire team. Tensions rose quickly as the crew realized they were being asked to participate in, or at least silently accept, this injustice. Dan Blocker didn't blink. When he learned about the hotel's policy, he went forward and stated his position unequivocally. If the hotel would not treat all members of their crew equally, then nobody from the production would reside there. It wasn't a strategic gesture or an organized protest. It was a visceral reaction, an instant one. Blocker made the manager aware that they would be moving their business elsewhere, and he made good on his word, leading the group to a different hotel that accepted all of them without prejudice. No grandstanding, no need for applause, merely a refusal to endure exclusion. He acted quickly and decisively, requiring the whole team to disrupt their plans in defense of fundamental human dignity. What made this moment so galvanizing was the directness and clarity with which it happened. Blocker did not hold a press conference or utilize the incident as a means of getting publicity. He did not request anyone's approval or hold a vote. He merely chose not to be a participant in segregation. It was an act of individual conscience, acted out in the moment, without drama. The flight crew, most of whom would remember the incident years later with a combination of pride and thankfulness, deferred to him out of duty, but because it was so clearly the right thing to do. To those who saw it happen, this act made a lasting impression, not because it was showy, but because it was so uncompromisingly human. This one episode constitutes an isolated but indelible moment of civil courage. In an era when so many closed their eyes to systemic discrimination, Dan Blocker acted without hesitation. He wasn't acting for a cause or joining a movement. He was simply standing up for his fellow employees when faced with wrong. That action, done in silence and with no fanfare, reinforced a principle that had no need of speeches or slogans. It had needed only the courage to say no in a time when silence would have been simpler. The appetite of a legend. Dan Blocker's physical size was matched only by his equally legendary appetite, a trait that those who knew him never forgot. From a young age, he had a voracious hunger that seemed to grow right along with him, and as an adult, his meals were nothing short of epic. A typical breakfast for Blocker could include a dozen eggs, stacks of toast, bacon or sausage, and an entire pot of coffee. Sometimes with a quart or two of milk on the side, he ate heartily and often, favoring rich, hearty, down-home meals that reflected his Texas roots. On set, crew members would marvel as he devoured multiple helpings without hesitation, joking that feeding Dan was like feeding an army. While his fellow actors might nibble at salads or light fare, Dan would pile his plate high with meat, potatoes, and bread, often returning for seconds and thirds. Mealtime was never a drudgery for Dan, it was a pleasure. Friends and co-stars remembered how much he enjoyed discussing food, exchanging recipes, and breaking bread with others. Whether it was an afternoon barbecue in the backyard or a large restaurant meal, he met food with a festive attitude. He especially loved Southern staples such as fried chicken, ham, and cornbread. And he was not afraid to express his affection for sweets either. Pies, cakes, and cookies were all up for grabs. It wasn't quantity that he coveted. Dan did love flavor, texture, and preparation. He would often find local favorites on his travels and loved to find hole-in-the-wall diners with authentic comfort food. Eating was, for him, not just a necessity, but one of life's greatest pleasures. This profound love for quality cuisine inevitably spilled over into business. Cashing in on his bonanza fame, Dan was made a co-owner and spokesperson for the Ponderosa Steakhouse chain, a restaurant chain born of the fictional Cartwright family ranch. The idea was straightforward: generous portions of comfort, American-style cuisine in a friendly, family-oriented atmosphere. It was the sort of restaurant Dan himself would enjoy, and he saw to it that the menu was consistent with that. Steaks, burgers, and substantial sides were the bulk of the fare, with buffet service allowing customers to eat as much as they pleased. Dan's investment wasn't purely monetary. Dan was proud of the undertaking, visiting stores from time to time and speaking with customers who shared his passion for filling, comforting meals. Dan Blocker's attitude towards food turned out to be one of the most enduring and endearing aspects of his public image. Viewers did not just regard him as a gentle giant on the screen, but also as an individual who indeed savored life's little pleasures, particularly a good meal. He introduced an air of reality to his food-related pursuits, and his famous appetite turned out to be a lovable aside to the narrative of his life. Whether sitting at the family dinner table or assisting in forming a restaurant chain, Dan's passion for food put another twist on the warmth and charisma that so many people respected in him. In a world of actors carefully watching their diet and counting calories, Dan Blocker was someone who reveled in the joy of a full plate and contented smile. A sudden goodbye. In early 1972, Dan Blocker checked into Daniel Freeman Hospital in Inglewood, California, for what was expected to be a routine medical procedure. He had been suffering from gallstones, a common but painful condition, and his doctors recommended gallbladder removal surgery to resolve the issue. At the time, such operations were considered relatively low risk, and there was little reason for concern. Blocker, then only 43 years old, was in generally good health, aside from his size, and both his family and physicians anticipated a straightforward recovery. The procedure itself reportedly went smoothly, and initially, there were no alarming signs of complications. But within hours of the surgery, a tragic and unforeseen medical complication. Dan Blocker had developed a pulmonary embolism, a sudden obstruction of a lung artery by a blood clot. Such a complication, although rare, is often fatal if not detected sooner. In Blocker's situation, the embolism developed quickly and became impossible to reverse. In spite of the most diligent care by hospital personnel, he died on May 13, 1972. Death came quickly and unexpectedly, giving his closest relatives little time to accept what had happened. The reality that so formidable a man, so physically powerful, should be felled by something intangible and inside served to highlight the uncertainty of post-operative dangers. After his death, speculations were made about how he would be buried because of his size. Dan Blocker was more than 300 pounds when he died, and this led to speculations that he would not fit a standard casket. One particularly insistent myth was that he was buried in a piano box, a peculiar and overstated image that approximated the oversized persona he presented on the screen. The legend picked up momentum over time, repeated in tabloids and retellings that played up its bizarre, almost folkloric appeal. It added an otherworldly element to the otherwise abrupt and tragic circumstances of his death. In fact, the piano box tale is completely untrue. Dan Blocker was buried in a regular oversized coffin, the type that is usually used for people of larger build. His funeral was held at Woodman Cemetery in his hometown of DeKalb, Texas, close to where he was born. The service was private, with only family and close friends present, as his family had requested. No spectacle, no oversized coffin, merely a subdued farewell in the red dirt Texas earth that had molded his childhood. The myth of the piano box, while vivid, belies the very real and very human death of a man who had lived with strength and simplicity. But even after the final farewell, one voice had yet to speak, and when it did, it revealed more than anyone expected. Durk Blocker's long-held truth. At the age of 66, Durk Blocker, Dan Blocker's youngest son, shared a personal and long-withheld reflection about his father that offered a rare and intimate look into the man behind the public figure. In a candid interview, Durk opened up about aspects of Dan's character that had remained largely private for decades, revealing that much of what fans had long suspected about his father's inner life was, in fact, true. According to Durk, Dan was not only a loving and attentive father, but also someone who carried the weight of deep emotional sensitivity. He described his father as a man who often internalized his struggles, choosing silence and stillness over open displays of vulnerability. Not because he lacked emotion, but because he felt it so profoundly that it often overwhelmed him. This quiet depth, Durk said, was something even close friends and extended family didn't really understand in Dan's lifetime. It wasn't that Dan kept his feelings hidden, it was that he revealed them in subtle, intentional ways, through small acts of tenderness, through long moments of contemplation, or simply through his steady presence. Durk explained that as a kid, he sometimes confused this silence for distance, but as he grew older, he realized it for what it truly was, a strong, lasting expression of love that went deeper than words. At 66, Durk said he finally felt ready to comprehend and explain what his dad had been attempting to demonstrate all along. This realization, he explained, transformed how he recalled his childhood and rewrote his relationship with his father's memory. Perhaps the most poignant moment of Durk's introspection was his admission that Dan Blocker had carried an inner consciousness with him at all times of the transience of life. His father, in Durk's recollection, was most troubled by the ephemeral nature of things and frequently stopped during day-to-day moments to thank someone or reflect on significance. Durk remembered times when Dan would just sit with his family quietly, soaking up the moment like he knew it could never return. This kind of awareness, Durk acknowledged, wasn't something he ever truly knew or valued until much later in life, when he had known loss and maturity himself. His dad's silence, which was once a mystery to him, was now a language that he finally comprehended, one of quiet wisdom. What made Durk's admission so profound to the public was how it confirmed long-time speculation on the part of many fans, that beneath the soft glow of Dan Blocker's on-screen persona lay a man of uncommon emotional perception. Durk did not give stories of success or stardom. He gave a picture of a father whose greatest gift was not what he did, but how intensely he felt, and how diligently he cared. It redefined how many saw Dan Blocker, not only as an actor or even a popular person, but as a father, husband, and man whose stillness was incredibly strong. Through the words of Durk, the quiet reality of Dan Blocker's life came into greater perspective, not merely recalled, but at last understood. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this look into Dan Blocker's life, be sure to like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more stories that dig deeper than the headlines. And don't go just yet. Click the next video on your screen to uncover another side of a star you thought you knew.